In this video, we're going to go over creating constraints for your animation. So if you want the character to interact with an object, you're going to be working with constraints. This means you'll be constraining the object to the character's hand or whatever parts of the body that you want the character to come in contact with the object. In this scene, we're going to have Bunsey walk along, come to a stop, and then bend down to pick up the flower. Afterwards, we're going to animate him dropping the flower. So not only are we going to get into animating the constraints, but we're going to get into how do you blend between animation keys and the constraint itself. Now I'm applying this constraint after I've gotten all of my timing down and gotten all my poses in. The reason for that is when I'm retiming stuff, it's very easy to forget that you have constraints unless you have the object selected or have the constraint as part of your actual mail buttons. So I want to get all my timing down first and make sure it's all correct before I start animating the constraint. Really, the less timing editing I have to do with the constraint, the better. So let's first decide on where we're going to put this constraint. So by scrubbing through my scene, I want to make sure that I actually have a pose where the character is making physical contact with the object. As for the object itself, I want it to start out straight at 0, having the transformations frozen. So if you move the object into place to get it into position for the character to interact with it, make sure you go to Modify and freeze your transforms on that object. This way we know where our starting value is. We can always get back to that if something doesn't quite go right. We can always just zero everything out and get back to where the object was at the beginning. So we have our object zeroed out, transformations frozen, and we have the character making contact with the object. Now this doesn't have to be necessarily perfect. You can see that the thumb isn't quite reaching down to meet up with the stem of the flower, but that's more or less going to be hidden behind the flower. You can see how large the actual petals are on the flower and everything. But we do want to actually feel like there is physical contact being made. Otherwise, when the character lifts it up, it's going to really look like it's floating there. So on this frame is where we're going to apply our constraint. And to do this, we're going to be applying a parent constraint. So this means it's going to take both the translation and the rotation values of the hand and apply it to the flower, so that if he's moving it around, no matter how he moves his wrist, the flower is going to follow the hand. I'm going to be applying that to the actual hand control so that it actually picks up the translation and rotation values from that. You want to remember that anytime you're applying these constraints, that's what you're going to be applying it to, is the actual control curves. You're never going to try to apply it to anything like the geometry or anything like that. In more advanced cases, it's possible to do it to joints, but for everything we do in this class, we're just going to be using the control curves themselves. So first I'm going to select the parent, so selecting the hand control, and then I'm going to shift select the flower control, and then come up to constrain, parent, and our option box. Now this is a really important thing you want to make sure is checked on, is maintain offset. If you don't have maintain offset checked on, what's going to happen is the object is going to snap to the hand. Basically, they're going to line up both of the center pivot points. So the center pivot point of the flower is going to snap to where the wrist is, kind of thing. With maintain offset, they're going to stay the same distance apart, so we don't get any snapping happening there. So this is what's going to help us blend between the character touching the flower and then actually being constrained and picking it up. Obviously, we want all of our translations and all of our rotations, so we're getting all of our translate axes and all of our rotation axes, and our weight is at 1. With that done, we're going to go ahead and hit add. And now you notice the flowers channels, if I just select off of the hand and just select the flower itself, its controls, it's going to turn the channels blue. This means that those channels on the flower have now been constrained. They're getting their input values from an actual constraint node. And we can find that right here in the flower parent constraint. Here is what we're really going to want to focus on, is the object that is constrained to, in this case the left arm weight. This is what we're going to be animating to turn the constraint on and off. So right now these values are just the blue channels right here are just saying that those values are being constrained. This is what we're actually going to be animating. Here where we're making contact with the object, we have a weight of 1. So to show you now what's happening, remember that we're on 92, this is where all is taking place, but I'm going to scrub off of this so you can see what's actually happening. With a weight of 1, that means that the flower is going to follow the hand. If I come in and type in a weight of 0, that means that the constraint is effectively turned off now. So there's no weight being put from the flower onto the hand. There's no weight in the constraint governing it. So now when I scrub off of it, the flower stays in place. So again, let's set this to 1 on 92. And right click, key selected. Now when we're doing these constraints, we're really going to be working in one frame changes, so whether this is in stepped or linear auto isn't going to make a big difference because we're only going to be doing switches in one frame. Within one frame, it's either on or off. There's not going to be any gradual changes in there, otherwise you're going to end up with some unsatisfactory floaty kind of things possibly, or you're going to end up with the object jumping around when you don't want it to be jumping around, as it's basically going from a binary 0 to 1 but trying to gradually get there. Now you can see also, even though I've put a key right here on this constraint, it shows up in the graph editor but not in our timeline. This is kind of where I was going back to the whole making sure our timing is correct first, because it can cause some issues if trying to retime stuff with the constraint. That's because the constraint itself, you would have to select to retime it. So if I go up to my Windows and hierarchy and go and find my constraint, this is the control for the flower itself. This is my constraint right beneath it, and there you can see there's the key for that constraint. So it isn't like it's like you can't move it at all, but you do have to kind of go through your outliner or your hypergraph, things like that, to go and find that constraint. Now, with it keyed with full weight on 92, before it makes contact, the frame before it makes contact, we don't want it to have any weight on it. We want the flower to stay in place. And then on 92 is when it actually attaches to the hand, when they actually make contact. So I'm going to middle mouse back one frame onto 91, and here I'm going to change my weight to 0, and then key selected. So this means all the way in the scene up until 91 and including 91, so everything from frame 1 to 91, the weight is at 0. So you're going to get the flower staying in place up until then. And then on 92, it switches in one frame and goes to being constrained to the hand. So all through here, flower stays in place. He leans down, makes contact with the flower, and then it follows the hand after that. Alright, so that's pretty straightforward. So we have him picking up the flower, and it's following the hand as we need it to. Now we need the character to actually drop the flower when he reacts. So when the character pops up there, when the hand opens up, we're going to drop the flower at that high point there and have him let go of it, and then we'll just drop it down. Now obviously, because those things, the flower right now is being influenced strictly by the constraints, I can't just go ahead and try to move it around and so forth, because it's just constrained. So that whole maintain offset that we set up before just basically means that it's going to keep the same distance from the wrist pivot point. But since we're going to be animating it anyway, that means we need to set keys. It needs to start out up here at the top and then drop down. So we need to set keys on this. So again, I'm going to find out where we're starting from, 182, and much like how we did before, we're going to find the point of contact. Now we're going to find the point of when we want to let it go. Basically the last time he was going to be holding it. So it's going to be this at this highest point on 182. Notice that I'm pretty much setting my constraint keys on my key poses. So the same keys that my character has, that's where I'm setting the constraints for the actual flower, the object he's interacting with. So up at the top here of this motion, I'm going to select my translation and rotation values, right click, and on key selected. And something new is going to happen here once I do this. So if you're noticing right there, few things happened. The channels changed from they didn't change pink like they don't normally do when you key something, and they're not blue anymore. Now they've changed to green. So a green channel means that there are two different incoming connections. In this case, it means that there's keys coming in and there's a constraint coming in. So the object we've just keyed has also been constrained. So this means that Maya's getting information from two different places, and it needs our help in telling which ones it should be listening to at any given time. That is governed by this new channel that gets added anytime you key something that has a constraint on it. This blend parent channel is what governs the whether Maya is going to follow the keys on an object or follow the constraint on an object. So we'll also be animating this so that we have control and can tell Maya what we want to do at any given time. So right now, blend parent at 0 means that it's going to follow the actual keys, which means it's going to stay in place because we keyed it right there at the top of that arc. At the top of that motion, it stays in place. Blend parent at 1 means follow the constraint. Since the constraint is still on, that means if I set this to 1, it's going to continue following the hand and ignore the keys. So we're going to be using that in conjunction with our keys, and even you can use it with the actual constraint animation if you're going to be constrained to multiple objects and so forth as well. You can animate between multiple constraints even. But for our purposes, we're going to be using it to animate between the keys we have here and our constraints. So we're not really going to have to animate between multiple constraint objects here. So here we are at the top of this, and we're going to go ahead and again key that at 0, because at this point I'm going to want it to start following the keys, and I already keyed my values here. Much like before though, up until that point I do want it to follow the hand, so I'm going to middle mouse back one frame and then change my blend parent to 1. This means that up until then it's going to be following the constraint, not the keys. And then key selected. So the hand lifts up, but then the flower stays there. From here we can animate the flower normally. So let's say if I want it to drop down, say 8 frames. In 8 frames, we can go 8 frames later, translate the flower down to the ground, and again key our translations and rotations. Now obviously that we probably don't want to keep in linear because it's over several frames and this is just the flower just translating to the ground, so we don't want to keep it in stepped, I should say. So let's go ahead and change that to auto. So it comes up and then animates just as we need to put in the keys for it. Now if we're going to go further with that, put in more keys, maybe add a little bit of bounce or whatnot, or rotate it so it doesn't quite land like this, that's perfectly fine. Again, we're animating it just like we would animate anything else at this point. This is more just to show you technically what's happening to animate the constraints and the blend parent. So, to review, when you're applying your constraint, you want to apply it at the point of contact. Wherever that body part is going to be physically interacting with the object, that's where you want to stop and then apply your constraint. You want to open up your constraint menu, select your parent first, the object that's going to be driving the action, and then the object that's interacting with, just by shift selecting. Open up your constraint, make sure that maintain offset is checked on before you apply it. Once you have that, you're going to make sure that the weight is set to 1 on that point of contact pose. 1 frame before it, you're going to set the weight to 0. This way, up until he makes contact with it, there is no weight going to the object. It's going to just sit there in space until the character actually makes physical contact with it, and then they pick it up. Now, if your character is not doing going to be dropping the item or putting it back down or anything like that, that's the extent of what you need to have for the constraint, is just picking up the object, holding onto it. If that's going to be held onto for the entirety of the scene, then that's really all you need there. But if you're doing something more complex where the character is going to end up having to drop the object again or put it down somewhere, then you're going to want to actually put keys on the object and create a blend parent and blend between the actual constraints and the keyframes. Now to do that, you want to find the point where the character is going to be letting go of the object. The last point of contact for his hand or whatnot is going to be making physical contact with the object. At that point, place keys on the translation and rotation values. That's going to change your keys green, and it's going to automatically add the blend parent channel here. Once you have that blend parent channel, it basically just says, should I follow the constraints you have for this object, or should I follow the keys you have for this object? When it's set to 1, it's going to follow the constraint. When it's set to 0, it's going to follow the keys. So here, we're going to set it at 0 so it follows the keys, and we'll start to animate that normally. But first, after we set that to 0, we want to make sure that, again, we key all the translation and rotation values, key the blend parent, and then 1 frame before that, we go in and change the blend parent back to 1. So up until that point, it's following the hand. Then going forward from there, you can animate the object as normally. So that covers animating with constraints. Thanks for watching.